So we have now our keynote speaker for the day. It's a great pleasure to introduce Jane Nelson. Jane has more than 30 years of experience on the intersection between the public and the private sector and trying to make these two sectors talk with each other. She's the director of the Corporate Responsibility Initiative at Harvard, at the Harvard Kennedy School. And she's also a senior fellow at Brookings. She has a very long CV. I will not go through it. But I would like to highlight that she has at least 3 strong links with Geneva and, in a sense, with the Graduate Institute. She has worked at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is hosted here in the Maison de la Paix. She has close cooperation with the World Economic Forum, which is based in Geneva, and we also have close cooperation. And she was also the advisor of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan for the relationship between the UN and the private sector. And of course, Kofi Annan is an alumni of the Institute. So Jane, as I said, has 30 years of experience. She has written 5 books, published hundreds of articles. So I'll give her the floor. Thank you, Jane.
Thanks, Ugo, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an enormous pleasure to be here as part of this first annual conference of our emerging practitioner and academic research network on private sector and development. And it's a pity it's sort of taken us so many years to get such a network going, but I think a great network to be developing. And sort of looking around the room and recognizing a number of other very long-standing colleagues who have also, for the last sort of 25, 30 years, been working on what I sort of see as a sort of a dual shared agenda. First of all, working to sort of try to see, how do we increase the level of private sector investment in emerging markets and market-based activities, both through foreign investment as well as domestic investment and resource mobilization, and also through both large companies, state-owned enterprises, and medium, small, and micro enterprises. And then secondly, along with how do we increase the level of private investment and market-based activities, obviously the focus of this discussion and conference, how do we improve the development impact of those activities? And initially, and still very importantly, we've had obviously all of these years a very strong focus on the sort of the impact on local economic growth, competition, productivity, obviously market linkages and job creation, which, as I say, remain as important as ever. But I think sort of 3 areas of other impact analysis in recent years. First of all, the impact of private sector activities, and particularly someone talked about elite capture in the last session, the role of the private sector and its impact on governance, on institutions, on rule of law within emerging economies. Secondly, obviously its impact on the environment. And then thirdly, our focus here, its impact on people. And both on people, which we're focused on specifically here, that are participating directly in company value chains as producers, as suppliers, as workers, as distributors, as retailers, and as customers, and the people who are affected indirectly by the impact of private sector investments and markets as citizens. And I think it's fair to say that we've come a long way, and I think have made there's solid progress over the last 30 years or so. But I personally think we're at a very sort of challenging and sobering time. And I think we sort of face a dual challenge, because on the one hand, as we all know, it's going to be absolutely impossible to fill the estimated $2.5 trillion financing gap annually, and also to create the additional 600 million new jobs we need by 2020, without substantially increasing engagement with the private sector investment, and improving impact. And yet, on the other hand, we're in a situation where public trust in business, and especially, I think, in large corporations and state-owned enterprises, is disturbingly low in many economies and countries. You're following the global financial crisis, evidence of growing inequality, climate change, resurgence of populism, nationalism, and I think various forms, and several speakers have mentioned it, of political, social, and economic exclusion. There is a growing sense amongst citizens, and not just the most vulnerable and poorest of them, that the economic and political systems are just not working for their benefit. And so we, I think, face this dual challenge of both needing to increase private sector investment, innovation, inclusive business models, impact investing, and at the same time increase private sector accountability and trust in business and the private sector. And that's why the type of work that this research network is doing, I think, is so important. First, understanding the behavior and development impact of private firms and markets. Second, really understanding what are the types of business models, enterprises, and sectors that are most inclusive and socially beneficial. And then thirdly, how can we obtain that credible evidence of those positive development impacts and also avoid the negatives, as we heard in the last panel. So from my perspective, having worked mostly with large companies and large institutional investors, what are some of the lessons we've learned about making private sector investment more inclusive? And I'd like to focus on three broad areas of lessons that I think are particularly important. And the first is what I'd call the imperative for responsible and accountable business practices broadly. Secondly, the imperative for scaling innovation and research in specific inclusive business models, financing models, technologies, and sectors. And then thirdly, the imperative for system-level collaboration to overcome some of the systemic obstacles we face to making markets more inclusive. So I want to just sort of very quickly go through sort of some of the reflections and lessons learned in those sort of three areas. And first of all, the imperative of sort of responsible and accountable business practices. I think it's fair to say that respecting human rights, tackling corruption, paying fair corporate taxes, being publicly accountable for performance, and really being committed to a decent work agenda and living wage is probably one of the greatest contributions that most companies in any industry sector can make to poverty alleviation and also inclusion. And I think it's interesting, having just observed International Anti-Corruption Day earlier this week, Antonio Guterres reminded us that the UN estimates that corruption costs the global economy more than 5% of GDP every year, and approximately $1 trillion paid in bribes and $2.6 trillion stolen annually through corruption, so $3.6 trillion every year. And one of the things that's just been announced in the last couple of weeks is the Global Reporting Initiative that works with mostly large companies on sort of environmental social governance reporting, has just launched a tax transparency component of their reporting requirements. And so just encouraging all companies to do more in terms of tax transparency, respecting human rights, I think is crucial to me as part of the overall inclusion and poverty alleviation agenda. The Business and Sustainable Development Commission has noted, in addition to the $12 trillion business opportunity, which I'll come to, they have noted that treating workers with respect and paying them a decent wage would go one of the furthest ways to building a more inclusive society and expanding consumer markets, and ensuring that the social contract extends from the formal to the informal sector through full implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights should be non-negotiable. And I think there's a real danger that we sort of feel we've moved beyond that sort of, risk management, respect human rights agenda to the very exciting impact investing, innovation agenda. And both of them, to me, they're two sides of the same coin. And I think particularly recognizing the work of the IFC and then following that, all of the DFIs in the room with the performance standards, the equator principles, which are arguably more important than they've ever been, as well as the accountability pillar of the new impact investing principles. And those are, sort of the frameworks in the development finance world, but things like the Ethical Trading Initiative that differed, has been very involved in helping set up and is over 20 years old now. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. I think there are a number of sort of business, public-private frameworks for responsible business practices, which we need to get right, I think, if we want to address the inclusion agenda. And going forward, there's clearly going to be needed a lot more work in terms of understanding the unintended negative consequences of new technologies, and that's been discussed in a lot of sessions over the last few days, and sort of collective action around that. And I know there's some very interesting work that Microsoft and others are doing, and you're understanding how do we govern AI and some of these very exciting technologies to avoid their negative impacts. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we're going to see a lot more collaboration around tax transparency. So that's sort of to me, the sort of first critical sort of foundational component of addressing more inclusive business models. And as came up in the question in the last panel, and I think the panelists, answered it very well, as we move into the very exciting inclusive business models, going in with a mindset at a minimum being very clear what might be some of the negative unintended consequences, whether it's exclusion around ethnic conditions and balance in market power, over-indebtedness, lack of living wage for many producers in value chains, unintended consequences of digital tech. Going into inclusive business models thinking, how do we avoid those, I think is a crucial sort of first step. So that's the first, to me, foundation of what we're learning about the role of the private sector and inclusion and poverty alleviation. Secondly, then, is the innovation imperative and this incredible opportunity, which we've obviously been very focused on the last 2 days, on new business models, new financing models, new technology platforms, to very explicitly include low-income producers, suppliers, workers, distributors, retailers, and consumers. And there are 5 sets of lessons I'd like to highlight, and again, they've come up again and again in the last few days, so I'll be brief in each of them. But a sort of overall comment is the sort of recognition of how difficult this is, and the fact that certainly from my side, looking at mostly multinational companies, we can still count them probably in the dozens, maybe the hundreds, certainly not the thousands who are implementing these models. And so what are some of the lessons we're learning? And I think the first set of lessons is very much around the fact that almost all private sector firms, whether they're large companies or they're social enterprises, need to be very intentional about either adapting business models or designing, testing, and retesting, and often retesting new business models to include low-income sort of business partners along their value chain. And the reason is obvious. We know it because of the major constraints that a lot of the low income, whether they're producers or customers, face. Their financial constraints, their operational, their capacity constraints, social norm constraints, awareness constraints. And so being very intentional about, I think, a number of aspects of the business model. First of all, and it came up in the last session as well, targeting and customizing, very much sort of based on the needs and the operating context of whether it's sort of customers or suppliers that the companies or the social enterprises are trying to work with, and tailoring very much to their needs. Secondly, I think more and more evidence now of the crucial need to bundle services, and whether it's financial services, input services, business development services, advisory services, and I think the important role that some of the DFIs and in partnership with donors can play in terms of combining both the financial and the technical assistance and advisory services. And then sort of, thirdly, clearly, and I'll come to that just now, the sort of leveraging technology platforms. But I think we're learning a lot about the business models. I would take a little bit of issue with my colleagues who say, we've got to focus on the commercial side of the business. This isn't the social responsibility side of the business. I think in a lot of cases with these business models, it's particularly initially a hybrid. And I don't think, one should sort of completely dismiss one. I mean, obviously the whole goal is to make these fully commercially viable business models. But I think, M-Pesa is one of many, many examples where, certainly from the company perspective, it sort of started more in the sustainability, corporate responsibility part of the company as part of the, the testing, the innovating, sort of ring-fenced from a hurdle rate perspective. And then once proof of concept is more demonstrated, can very much then mainstream, more into the commercial side of the business. So sort of understanding the internal incentives, the internal structures within companies, I think is important on the business model side. Some of us were in a session earlier looking at sort of corporate impact venturing and the opportunity for more and more partnerships between large companies and social enterprises, where the social enterprises have got the business models right, but they're really innovative and agile, but they're struggling to scale. The large corporations have scale capability, but are struggling to innovate, and finding more opportunities for social venturing between those is a high potential area. And I think another high potential area in terms of sort of business models and particular projects is looking for those sort of what we'd call either anchor investments or transformative investments, which are going to be an anchor to either reduce the cost of subsequent investment or increase the returns of subsequent investment. So I think there's an enormous amount of knowledge now around the business model agenda and what works and what doesn't, but still more research needed there. Secondly, clearly, is the growing understanding of this diverse range of financial instruments and mechanisms and different asset classes that are needed, and in almost all cases, the need to combine the sort of financial services with technical assistance. And I think here, one of the key sort of emerging trends and thoughts is that it's not just about getting the financial instruments right and the tools right, but about sort of financial strategies more broadly. And I think all the DFIs in this room are certainly doing it, and many of the commercial companies now, where you have got a sort of strategy which allows a sort of a portfolio approach where you've got more flexibility and sort of ability to have risk in investing, and where one can combine a lot of different instruments and asset classes that can then be targeted as needed. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I think CGG's new paper on the stretch fund, I think, is a very interesting idea that would be worth looking at as a way going forward of a new type of public-private financing instrument that would allow a spectrum of instruments and approaches. So again, I think we're learning a lot about the sort of the diversity of instruments, asset classes, as well as sort of sources of capital in terms of blended capital that we need to make inclusive business models work. And now it's, how do we replicate and scale them more? Thirdly, and we've talked about it a lot, so I'll just touch on it very briefly, obviously the incredible scaling impact of leveraging and combining new technologies. And, digital platforms across pretty much every single sector now that are, as Junga said last night, enabling us to make these business models more efficient, more effective, more transparent and safe in many cases, but still, as I mentioned at the outset, being aware of some of the potential unintended consequences of those technologies, and making sure that the implementation is, sort of designed with end users in mind, as much as possible. But I think also the combination of digital technologies with, as they mentioned earlier, geospatial, satellite technologies, energy storage, biotechnology, this massive technology convergence. So it's not just about digital, but other technologies is going to be, I think, very important going forward in terms of inclusion and inclusive business models. Fourth is so we've sort of got getting the business models right, the sort of the spectrum of financing mechanisms, the technology platforms, is this growing recognition of the importance of building the capacity, the voice, and the organizing capability of the low-income producers, workers, consumers in the value chains, and being very intentional and thoughtful about the power dynamics that are often at play in the way that these business models and relationships are designed. And so here, things like the combination of technical assistance with financing is a crucial part of building capacity and voice of these lower income partners, supporting aggregation models, and that's very popular on sort of smallholder farmer side, but I think in many other sectors as well, sort of aggregation models have enormous potential. Obviously, the growing focus on gender and women's empowerment, and then as a number of people have talked about, sort of participatory monitoring, participatory design in these new business models, and initiatives and platforms like Lean Data and 60 Decibels, where there's a much more sort of stakeholder engagement process built in, right from the beginning. And here, I think, enormous potential for NGO partnerships. And then finally, in terms of the business models, and again, numerous people have spoken about this potential for deepening and diversifying our sector approaches. And obviously, IFC now does have their 25 sector frameworks, but particularly, I think, financial services, agriculture, information communication technology, looking at a sort of sectoral level of the various aspects. So in financing, it's not just about the MFIs, but about housing finance, microinsurance, and looking at that overall financing ecosystem or food system or agribusiness system from a sectoral approach. I think we've got a lot of lessons that have been learned there. So that's sort of the second category. So the responsible business practices, the innovations in inclusive business models. And then third and finally, this collaboration at the system level. And again, we've heard it throughout the last few days, from as a community, what can we be doing not only to make sure we're getting the actual business models and financing and technology correct and having participatory approaches, but what can we do collaboratively at a systems level? And I think, sort of Estelle's comments yesterday about the sort of the different parts and sort of interventions in the ecosystem usually being provided by different actors in the ecosystem need to enable and reinforce each other, not sort of either undermine each other or create gaps. And that really requires a systems integrator, a systems leader, and I think it's an important role, particularly at the country level, that country offices of an IFC or other DFI country offices could play in terms of being a system coordinator, system integrator without setting up new institutional mechanisms, but sort of understanding, how do you bring together, what are the enabling regulations, what's the infrastructure needs, what are the skills and training needs, the awareness building requirements, financing, information, and who are the different actors in the system providing it, and how do those actors come together? And there's a lot of work the World Economic Forum and others are doing now on this concept of systems leadership, and I think at a country level, it's an important role that some of the DFIs could play. And Juna spoke last night about transformative regulatory policy. I think in pretty much every sector now, we know what a lot of the policy shifts need to be in terms of ensuring greater inclusion in private sector development. And the question is, we're not getting there. And possibly the idea of sort of advocacy coalitions, either at a sector level or at a country level between public and private partners with government, to look at policy innovation around a inclusive business agenda is one area where there, I think, is potential. And we're certainly seeing that in financial inclusion. The Better Than Cash Alliance and others that are working at either a country or a sectoral level, to bring the different sort of particularly regulatory frameworks in that case together. The whole sort of model of inclusive ecosystem accelerators, and we're seeing more examples of that, the GSMA ecosystem accelerator, some of the work that MasterCard, Better Cash Alliance are doing, and I think that the opportunity to have accelerators, again, at either sector level or country level is still untapped. And then finally, the sort of collaboration around financing and technology platforms. And I think we already have great examples, scaling solar from the IFC perspective. I think the Stretch Fund proposal from the corporate perspective, Danone's ecosystem fund. There's some interesting models of sort of public-private collaboration to actually sort of strengthen the sort of the ecosystem of the sort of technology platforms and financing platforms. And then finally, I think another area, and it was discussed in the last panel, where there is a lot of collaboration happening, and it's going to be crucial going forward, is obviously around the sort of the, if not complete standardization, sort of some standardization on the impact measurements and sort of benchmarking, and HIPSO, the Impact Management Project, and the Social Performance Task Force are all good examples of that. So to close, that's from my perspective, I think the sort of the three broad areas where we've got some, I think, very painful lessons to learn, but also many positive lessons at a very sort of broad strategic level on the responsible business practices and standards and really rigorous accountability for results and holding each other to be accountable for those results. Secondly, the innovation around business models, financing models, the sort of technology platforms, and sort of stakeholder engagement, participatory approach in innovation and sector-based innovation. And then thirdly, the sort of collaborative action, at the system level. And I think from a research perspective, in addition to all the work that's going on, as I think it was Miguel who sort of said in the last session, we've got research going on at the macro, the meso, the micro level, but what are the opportunities to make and create greater links between them? Possibly this network and the DFIs could think about a fund for multidisciplinary research. I think from an academic perspective, it's very difficult, obviously, to get multidisciplinary research published in academic peer-reviewed journals. Is there some innovative support that could be provided on that front? And then also, I think, from the corporate side, more research on sort of internal incentives, internal sort of structures within companies and the big private institution investors in terms of how they are structuring their businesses and their strategies across the sort of spectrum of responsible ESG, environmental, social governance standards, impact investing and innovation, systems change. And I think many of the big corporations and big institution investors, as I say, have at the spectrum of initiatives and models within their companies that they're using, and understanding those better and the incentive structures better is another, to me, interesting area of research in this field of business and inclusion. And then finally, on the policy innovation side, and we had an interesting conversation in one of the breakout groups, there's a lot of work done on policy reforms in the developing countries, but Christina Grudel was sort of talking about how French companies are often more innovative on impact investing than many of their peers elsewhere, and there's a number of policy nudges in France that encourages French companies to move in that direction. So what are some of the interesting policy lessons from an OECD country perspective? So I'll leave it at that, but I think it's an area where, as I say, many of us have been working on it for many years. It's concerning in some ways that certainly in terms of the actual inclusive business models, that there's still a relatively small number of both social enterprises that we all know as good examples and all invest in, and large corporations and institutional investors that are investing in this agenda. But the ones who are, I think, are demonstrating it can become commercially viable, it can scale if we get some of these other things right. And focusing on those for our research agenda going forward, I think, has enormous potential. So thanks for having me here, and good to be part of the network.
Questions? Yeah. So maybe not, we can take...
one up there.
So we have one from Paddy. We take 3 questions.
Thank you very much for that, Jane. I wanted to ask you whether some of the things that you have talked about what it means for a business to be doing good in the world, whether you see those things as ending up as a number on an impact accounting statement somewhere, or whether you think that it's going to be more a binary, this business is doing something good or it isn't.
We take 3, is okay?
Yeah, okay. So sort of almost 2 questions and that. Yeah.
Sorry if I'm feeling a little glass half empty today, Jane. Thank you very much for all of that, I should say positively first. But when I look back to 2010, I just don't quite feel the conversation has moved on enough. And we've only got 12 years to save the planet. We've got 2030 for the SDGs. What do you think would speed up change? And even beyond that, you say in some ways we know what some of the answers are, some of the things we need to do, and we need to collaborate more. Do we actually have enough of a shared vision that growth is not the end, and profit and enterprise growth is not the purpose, it's the thing that should get us to where we want? Have we actually sort of changed the consensus about what we're doing over the last decade or two to be successful?
Is it working? Yes, thank you very much, Jane. Just a very short question. I like your idea of the collaborative ecosystems. But my question is, who should take the lead to build these collaborative systems? Should it be the private sector? Should it be the DFI? Should it be academia? Should it be governments?
Yeah. Okay, great. I mean, Paddy, your question, I think two responses to it. I'm sort of very nervous at that second option of, either a company or a project is good or bad. I think you can say a project is good or bad, but I think one of the challenges from a company perspective is obviously the enormous complexity of their impacts and how one's assessing them, and linked to that, I'm still struggling with, and many of you in this room have far greater insight on this than I do, on bringing social impact down to a monetized value. And I don't know, as the conversation goes forward on impact, I think from a company perspective, there's what is their overall impact as a company, and you could take some of the big oil and gas companies who most people would argue is largely negative because of obviously because of the climate agenda, and yet they're often going to be one of our best hopes, I personally think, for making part of that transition to a low carbon economy in terms of their technical capabilities. So even if one takes a particular area and a particular industry sector, it's difficult to boil it down, I think, to an either good or bad. I do think of the benchmarking initiatives, so the Access to Nutrition Initiative, the Access to Medicines Initiative, the World Benchmarking Alliance, you're probably very familiar with. Still early days, but sort of a mixture of quantitative and qualitative benchmarking. And then things like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index as a way of, sort of judging companies, is the way to go. But I'm not sure if that's answering, and it'd be interesting to have a conversation with you on where you think on that. But Caroline, in terms of your response, I think again there's the danger of we focus a lot on the sort of specific inclusive business models, which are often ring-fenced in a small part of a company versus the overall corporate purpose. And as a colleague said it on the last panel, I think there is a bit of a shift underway in terms of corporate purpose. The UK Stewardship Code, the UK Corporate Governance Code, a number of other, the Canadians, a number of other national corporate governance codes now are shifting away from the shareholder primacy model to a stakeholder model. Now, again, what that's actually going to look like in practice and how companies get measured and evaluated on that is still up for debate. But I think the Business Roundtable statement, the 181 American CEOs who signed up to the Business Roundtable stakeholder statement, I think there was, and there probably should be, a lot of skepticism at one level, because it's, they've got to demonstrate it first, and there's a lot of evidence that that's not happening yet. And I was sort of initially, well, come on, we've been talking about this for such a long time that why they're only doing it now. But the fact that you have got 181 of the biggest companies who've got their general counsels and everyone to agree to the fact that they could sign up to a very explicit statement, and now we can, hold them to that on how are they actually meeting those explicit stakeholder commitments. So I think we're seeing some progress, but you're right. I mean, when you think of the level of urgency and some of the things coming out of COP25 last week, it's very worrying, but I do feel, initiatives like We Mean Business, some of these business coalitions, which really are trying to address some of the systemic challenges that we're facing, I personally feel, give cause for optimism, but, the things are still looking pretty grim, yeah. So, and then to the final question on who does it, I don't think there is an ideal who, but as I mentioned in my comments, I think as the IFC and the World Bank have more and more sort of country level offices, it could be the UN. I'm not sure academic institutions would have the resources for doing it, but a local chamber of commerce could do it. So I think it depends very much on the sector in question. I think certainly in the agribusiness sector, you're seeing sort of small groups of companies within, and often competitors and pre-competitive coalition being facilitated by a Technoserve or an intermediary organisation. So you're seeing, I think, some very interesting intermediary organisations. Actually, that is becoming their business model to serve as sort of systems integrators. I think it's easier at the global level. And we're sort of seeing a lot of those alliances at the global level. It's, I think, more at the country level and the sector level. Within countries, we need them. There are a few examples, but very little, to my knowledge, very little research and analysis has been done on how they came together, how they're being structured, what are the incentives, who's putting in what, and how are they being sustained. But it's, I think, one of the areas that to me has some potential to address issues at the country level. Thank you. Thank you.